Okay, I think it's time to begin. Good to have you this morning. Glad you joined us. Isaiah 53, we'll hopefully get through that chapter today. Isaiah 53, the heart of Isaiah. The context of this particular chapter in Isaiah actually begins, I think, in chapter 52, verse 13. We're going to go ahead and just read that again. This has been, in my judgment, what Isaiah has been leading up to. It is the Messiah as the suffering servant, the real Messiah, not, the application here, I think, is future. Even though we're still in the background of the captivity, the exiles are about to return home. After chapter 55, when we go into 56, it appears that the historical background has changed, and the message of Isaiah from 56 to 66 is addressing the attitudes of the people that are already, back in Jerusalem. So the post-exilic period, we would call it. And the message on the latter part of the book is a reminder, a continual reminder to the people now who have come out of exile, what put them in exile, and to encourage the leaders and everybody to continue to remain faithful to God, and God would, continue to bless. Of course, that's not how things happened. There's still a continual decline. There's no more, I would say, paganism in Israel after the exile, as we've emphasized. But there's other things that are the problem of the Israelites. One of the things that will be addressed is, they seek religious tradition. That seems to be what they go into. They come back to their homeland, everything's back restored, and they're starting to be prosperous again. And by the time that Jesus comes on the scene, they're complacent. And there's been the temptation of religious tradition and hypocrisy. They're not into paganism. They're not bound down to idols, and they're not secretly worshiping idols, but they certainly are not passionate and committed in the worship of God. So we ultimately have, AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And we end, the reign or the period of the Israelites as we know them from the Old Testament. AD 70 is basically the end. Israel after AD 70 is a different community. Yes, they're still Jews, but it's not the Israel that we have been following. It's a different commonwealth. And so the message of Isaiah of encouraging the people to remain faithful, of course, is not received, like the people of Israel didn't receive it earlier by the prophets at all either. So all of this is to say, this is why we need the suffering servant to come, the ideal king, the ideal Messiah, and this is what Isaiah is pointing to in the 53rd chapter. So if you don't know anything about Isaiah, you need to have a big circle around Isaiah 52, verse 13, to the end of chapter 53. That's the heart. That's the whole thing that's been leading up. Every king, every servant that God used was a failure in that they never were able to achieve the purpose of God. even though there were high marks and high points in the history of Israel, it was always, a lacking there of true spiritual commitment. Now, we do have in Isaiah, he speaks of the righteous seed, the remnant, and the remnant represents, those who've come out of captivity home, and there is a righteous seed that has been hinted at, those who have remained faithful to God despite all the circumstances that they've experienced. That's the righteous seed. And but still, in the returnees from captivity, it's not what it ought to be. So the prophet Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, you read that, the Israelites are still complaining, and God is identifying the sins that they are committing, how they're treating marriage, their spouses, how they're worshiping, they're going through the motions, there's no real heart and sincerity there. And all of this is just a continuation of things that can plague the church or religious people even today if we're not careful and take things for granted. So there's some real good lessons of reminder about keeping our attitude right, continuing to submit to God. But there's this hopeful window. So verse 13, behold, this is Isaiah 52, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up greatly, exalted, just as many were astonished at you, my people. Notice one of the reasons we're looking at this being the servant, which this servant ought to be capitalized because it is messianic. The contrast between one speaking about the individual servant and then about God's people, they're separated here. So Israel is not identified as the servant here. So verse 14, just as many were astonished at you, my people, so his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Thus he will sprinkle many nations, kings will shut their mouths on account of him, for what had not been told them they will see, and what they had not heard they will understand. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty, that we should look upon him. No appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. The question, it seems to be, the speaker here seems to be the remnant that have returned or are coming home. And the prophet, by inspiration, they're saying, looking forward to what Jesus is going to do, we never got it. It's like we never understood. We never believed. And the reason of this is because of what they were looking for, and what actually occurred was totally different. We have constantly reminded ourselves that the view of Israel concerning the Messiah was one of a great conqueror, like that of, the great leaders of, ancient peoples. You got Alexander the Great, you got Cyrus, you got all these great people who have, I'm talking about great in their strength and power. Nebuchadnezzar, these empires. Well, the empire of Israel was going to have its day. See, under the flag or the banner of its king, its Messiah. Now, Israel did at times. They had David, okay? And he was the mighty conqueror and leader of Israel. Then you had Solomon. And then you had, people that were not as, reputable in being known like Solomon, people used to come from all around just to hear Solomon's wisdom, you know. Then you'd have people like, you know, Hezekiah and Josiah, but they weren't, it wasn't enough spring to the nation of Israel to become what it wanted to be. And so there was always this looking forward to this mysterious one that had been promised, and the Jews believe that there is a Messiah that's promised. They just don't believe that it was Jesus. Even today, not all Jews who are called Jews are anti-Christ. Some, which we call Messianic Jews and things of that nature, do believe in Jesus. They're Jewish by descent, nationality. But the Jews of the first century, coming all the way up, when Jesus came, it didn't matter what Jesus did. I'm here, I'm the Messiah, look at what I've done, boom, 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 all these miracles, look at my birth, look at my lineage. They weren't impressed. And why is that? I mean, he had all the things that I would think that people would look for a Messiah. There was a lineage to Jesus. He's connected to David, right? Okay, so he's got a famous lineage to him. He did do miracles that were right in front of the people for an extended period of time. And even those who didn't believe in him and plotted to kill him saw the miracles. They never denied them. They would say something like, let's go, strategize, see how we can destroy this guy, or he has power of the devil, or, he's doing it by other means, sorcery. And the miracles were never denied. They were just, talked over or transferred to something else or denied as coming from God, yes. So what did Jesus need to have about him to be accepted by the Jews, the first century? What did he need? Okay, the royalty. There was no. He didn't have the entire royalty. He didn't have the gait or the carriage of royalty. Does it seem? No, maybe he had acne. I don't know. They say he's like everybody else. He wasn't pretty like everybody. I don't know. What is it about Jesus? But see, Isaiah 53 says there was nothing about his physical appearance that kind of stopped people in their tracks saying, wow. Like the first king of the United Kingdom, King Saul, what was unique about him? Yeah, he was very tall, head and shoulders above everybody else, David was, what? He was big, and he's also very good looking, evidently. He had something about him that people, recognized. My favorite one that never, got to where he wanted to is Absalom. He was the one that everybody swooned over, David's son, Absalom. But Jesus came and nobody swooned. Jesus came and they bumped shoulders, and the guy that bumped shoulders with him said, "Hey man, move over." Nobody would recognize that he's the Son of God. And so he interacts with people, and the common people start to appreciate at least he's a prophet. This is what the woman at the well said, right? John 4, Samaritan woman. I perceive that you're a prophet. Jesus started to reveal things about our life. Well, that's what Isaiah 53 is indicating from the standpoint of Israel, the one that's receiving it. It's like Isaiah is presenting him and says, we blew it. We completely missed it. Um, and the announcement that God's been making about the Messiah, who would have thought that God would have done it this way? Who would have believed our message? So this is why it is such a unique thing. I think Paul brings it out in 1 Corinthians when he says it's not the high and mighty that God called, it's who? Yeah, it's the other. It's the opposite. What humans deem as being extremely attractive and powerful and all that is rubbish to God. It's Paul presents the contrast to what humans seem to be enthralled about, and then what God elevates. It's two different things. Yeah.
When my youngest uncle Johnny was born way back when in Jasper, he was born the same day as a Jewish young boy to a Jewish family. For the first 12 years of his life, he would receive a present on his birthday from that family because Johnny was possibly born the same day as the Messiah.
Okay. Yeah, that's all right. Thanks. That's interesting. So he had something special about him. Well, the thing about, looking at the infant Jesus, probably the infant Jesus didn't look any different from any other infant, right? But what was special about him? Think about all the things that were happened around his birth. The shepherds and the men from the east coming, and the gifts that were given. This was because of the recognition of some and the heavenly, host revealing that this is the child. This is the one. If God had not revealed it, no one would have known it. It seems from the standpoint of what Isaiah 53 says. So, Jesus had the Spirit without measure. He was able to perform miracles. He healed people, and his reputation began to build because of the things that he was doing and the things that he was saying. And that's why they had all kinds of trouble with it. I mean, he's from Nazareth. Can any good thing come out of, didn't someone say that, out of Nazareth? What's the question? What's the answer? No, but it's really yes. Jesus did. So everything or every expectation of a human being is just turned upside down. So he has nothing about him from a worldly point of view that's attractive. His looks, his attire. I mean, at least John the Baptizer came and he was out in the wilderness. There was something strange about him, and he ate wild honey and locust, and and he was probably someone to really listen to. That people would come out and hear him, and he'd get in your face, and he'd talk like these prophets of old, at least the reputation that they had. Jesus came along, wasn't like that at all. They were just confused. Okay, surely, verse 4, so there's nothing about him that we would have recognized. We just missed it. It's just a confession of we've missed it. No one would have believed it. Then he turns and shifts, or the message turns and shifts to talk about what is unique about this servant. This is another reason why this is messianic. Because this servant, unlike Israel and any other servant that was identified by Isaiah, this servant has a substitutionary quality about him. And it's going to be developed in this chapter. He says, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. So, from the standpoint of an aerial view of the ministry of Jesus, okay, if you were to look at an aerial view, you'll see him. He heals people, he comforts them, he blesses them. See, he's taking away the sorrows and the people who are stricken and all that. But then we keep looking, and he's on a cross. He's being afflicted. Now, this is the other double whammy in the sense of why it was so strange and no one would have believed the message that God was given, is that Jesus was being punished as a criminal on a cross. And so his very death was a testimony to everybody that it's a shameful thing. It's repulsive. Why would we look to him who died on a cross? Who gets killed on a cross? The worst. It's all through the Old Testament, there's hints about death. To die on the cross is shameful. To be put on a tree, it's talking about how people were executed in the ancient days. How could my hope be in one who is dying a death like that? So, see, we have 20/20 vision. We know because we had the New Testament. But if you were back then and this guy did such a great thing and then he gets killed, this is why some of the apostles, they go back to fishing. Yes, Jesus says, that I'm going to be raised, but did they really believe that? No. So he takes griefs away, but then he's viewed as being stricken. If someone is dying the death of the cross as a criminal, he's being cursed by God. That's the parallel or the connection that people would make. Suffering would indicate God is cursing you. You've done something wrong. Job. We know Job didn't do anything wrong, right? Because we have the preface of the story. We know that Satan has challenged God. God is staking his reputation on the faithfulness of one human being. Go ahead, don't kill him. So everything happens to him. His three friends come, and what do they try to get him to do? Confess his sin. I mean, they try everything rhetorically, everything in rational, everything in emotional, and Job just sits there, and he defends his honor. He defends himself against his friends who see him as one that God is punishing for some reason. They don't know that actually God has staked his reputation on his faithfulness. Because Satan came along and said, yeah, you got this servant Job, but you protect him. Take away your hedge and he'll curse you. But he didn't. So, verse 5, but he was pierced through for our transgressions. See the atonement aspect of this servant? Israel is not identified as one who is taking upon the transgressions of another. This is different. Israel's not identified as bearing the burdens of others. Even the righteous remnant are not identified as that. This is totally different. He was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Some say bruised. Saying, the chastening for our well-being fell upon him. And by his scourging, we are healed. So this particular verse right here, all of this has New Testament references, to Jesus. Isaiah 53 is like the biography of Jesus. In all of his ministry, all that he suffered, all that he did. But it's still from Isaiah 53, some 750 years before even Jesus came to the earth. It's being presented as something very profound. And the Jews never got it. They never saw their Messiah. In fact, not only did they not see their king, they did what to him? How ironic is that? King Jesus comes. This is what what I think John is interesting, when John chapter 1 talks about Jesus coming into the world, he says he came into his own things. The neuter's used in Greek, which is talking about he came to his own, God came to his own things, his creation. And what happened? They rejected him. His own didn't receive him. So here it is again. Jesus is coming. God's coming to his own things. And what did the people do? Well, they killed him. Why did they kill him? Well, you could say they didn't recognize him, but I think Romans says it right. The reason is they were suppressing the truth by their own unrighteousness. That's the truth can be suppressed by the unrighteousness of our behavior, which is the way that Paul puts it in Romans 1. So, verse 6, the speaker characterizes himself, okay, and I think this is real. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. Now, that is the theme of Isaiah. And the theme, I think, of the Bible. Why is there judgment upon the earth or against people? Because people have gone their own way. They have turned from God's way. Isn't that the message of Isaiah? I mean, constantly the prophet talks about this and talks about how stubborn they are. What's fascinating is why would God spend so much time with such people? Because they're his own. How much patience do you have for your people? God has created the world, so the world is near and dear to him. Pinnacle of his creation is human beings. And the story of human beings and their turning away from the will of God goes all the way back to Genesis 3. God knew this would happen, by the way. But it still broke his heart. The way, it's presented that before the world was created, there was a plan for the redemption of human beings. So we come to the problem, and this is the problem. Each of us, notice how he says each of us. The stress is on what? Every individual of the collective, of the group. Each of us has turned to his own way. In contrast to that, but the Lord has called the iniquity, notice this substitutionary language, of this servant, which Israel could never be. This is why this is messianic. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to what? Fall on who? Him. At him, they're singular, masculine, singular. On him, on this person. The iniquity of us all. God has caused it to fall upon him. Now, that's a deep theological conversation. It's easy to understand as far as what it's saying, but think of the depth of it, of what it really means. So, if that is true, then potentially I'm not held what? I'm not held accountable for what? My wrongdoings, because they fell upon who? Him. Now, the way that I have that release, that is the guilt of that or the punishment that's coming, is faith into Messiah, which is developed in the New Testament. Here, it's talked about in this language of substitutionary atonement. So, the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. This servant, this one, this Messiah, this message that no one would have understood, appreciated, or anything. They just missed it. This is also an emphasis how much in danger eternally we were in, not realizing the magnitude. Now, the captivity was an observable sign of the seriousness of sin, but that didn't capture the magnitude of the consequence of sin, which ultimately is what? Eternal damnation away from God. So, verse 7, again, we go to the biography. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. Yet, he did not what? Open his mouth. So, what does that hint at? He's oppressed and he's being afflicted, but he didn't open his mouth. What's significant about that? I know that's what Jesus did. Pilate kept interrogating him, and they were just stunned. Don't you have anything to say? What does that say about the Messiah, the servant, the suffering servant? He's taking it for who? All of us. He's receiving the intimidation, the abuse, yeah, the death, yeah, but he's receiving the punishment for our sins. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. Now, this is the irony of what Jesus did, being God incarnate. The figure is the world is in control. Jesus is allowing things to happen. When in reality, the world is fulfilling the very plan that God had. So I want you to turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter talks about this, and this is, I'm sure, one of the passages in the New Testament that we're really familiar with. Verse 21 of chapter 2, 1 Peter. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and the guardian of your souls. That's a good commentary on this, isn't it? So, verse 7, Isaiah 53, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. He uttered no threats. Can you imagine being the one who's driving the nails into his hands and into his feet? Can you imagine being that one who's doing that? When you're following orders and everything, who's this guy? Clink, clink, Jesus. I don't know. This is just the irony of it all. Yeah, the miracles themselves would have surely given some people pause about taking action against him. He says, verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people to whom the stroke is due? So who would have ever thought that they would have been the benefactors themselves of what Jesus did? You see, the stroke was due to whom? The punishment was due to the transgressors, right? Us. But he took that upon himself. Never thought about that. Never contemplated that. So, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due? My people here, Isaiah seems to be talking, at this point. My people, the people of Israel, they crucified their own king. Verse 9, his grave was assigned with wicked men, and he was with a rich man in his death. His illusions, he died among criminals. He was buried in a rich man's tomb. I mean, how much detail do you need to have? It wasn't as if anybody could have contrived all of this on their own, like came up with this elaborate plan of fulfilling prophecy and say where I'm going to be born, this is going to happen to me, this is how it's going to fall out, this is what people are going to say, this is where I'm going to be buried, what's going to happen. All of this, that's nonsense. There's no way that this all could have been contrived. Verse 9, he gave a sign to the wicked man. He was with a rich man in his death because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. So, again, emphasizing the innocent nature of the one who is receiving the punishment for the guilty. But the Lord was pleased. Notice this. This is heaven's perspective of what's happening. The Lord was pleased to crush him, to bruise him, putting him to grief, if he would render himself as a what? A gift, a guilt offering. The Lord is pleased. What a great plan. But look at the cost involved, from a human point of view. I mean, this is quite profound. The ultimate in the substitutionary nature of what Jesus did in place of ourselves. So it was a delight to God, to the Father, for this to happen, to put the suffering servant through this ordeal, which he did willingly, all in order to become the guilt offering. Then it says, he will see his, what do you have? Seed, offspring. What do you think this is referring to? He will see what? Okay. Well, it's the Father talking about the Son, and then we're going to see the seed or the offspring of the Son. Who are they? That's us. That's us. That's people. We might say those converted to Jesus, to the Messiah. So God looks, or Isaiah looked 750 years before it even happens. He looked into the future and he saw who? He saw you. He saw people come to faith in Acts 2. He sees the offspring of what resulted from Jesus' death, from the servant's death. So, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. Who's that? Who's talking here? Who's the anguish of the soul? We've been talking about the good pleasure of the Lord taking delight in what the suffering servant is doing. He sees into the future of the result of all of that. Okay? Then it says, as a result of the anguish of his soul. What does that tell you about God and his relationship with the Son? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think we're seeing Isaiah opening up, seeing the heart of God and the relationship between, the Father and the Son and all that's happening. He says, as a result of his anguish, his soul, he will see it and be satisfied by his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, will justify the who. There's a shift here in language. Everything has been we and us, which is alluded to the Jewish people. Now we have inserted here a word that will carry over the many. Who do you suppose are the many? Huh? Non-Jews. All people. You remember, the Bible says the gospel came to the Jew first and then the Gentile. Here we have the difference between the us and the many. And so it's an interesting transition. He says, my servant will justify the many. He will bear not our iniquities, but whose? Their iniquities. See how all humankind is being covered here in this substitutionary nature of what Jesus is doing? It says, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide his booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he himself bore the sin of many and interceded, which means took their place, for who? Transgressors. So in this chapter, the whole plan of God's been revealed in specific detail of things that are going to occur with this servant of mine, the righteous one. And this is why we have labeled it as the suffering servant, because that's the nature of how he becomes the conquering king, which, we understand is the message of the gospel. But isn't that intriguing? Isaiah 53, that's just the heart. That's everything that he's been leading up to. King after king, people after people have all been failures. Everybody, all along. Hopes, and then they're crushed. Hopes crushed. Come to Isaiah 53. God's going to bring a Messiah, which has already been hinted to in Genesis chapter 3. And all along the way, But here, it's so detailed, and there's so many New Testament passages that reveal the suffering, servant, Isaiah 53, as being, the Messiah and all of his grandeur. And of course, his grandeur is his humiliation, his death, his execution, bearing on the cross the iniquities. But both Jew and Gentile are going to be benefactors of this. Now, that brings us to the end of that chapter 53. From here, it's like all downhill. Not in importance, but I mean we reached the top, and then we start being reminded of what has caused Israel to fail. And that is going to be emphasized. Verse 6, all of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. So that's going to be emphasized in chapter 54 and 55 and all the way, to the end of Isaiah. So anyway, that's it.